Welcome back, everyone, to the Reactions and Reviews series of the Under the Hood community. Today, I'm going to be reacting to a preprint titled Decades of Systemic Racial Disparities in Funding Rates at the National Science Foundation. This work is led by Christine Yifeng Chen and her colleagues. For those that are not in academia, a preprint is a manuscript that is in preparation or in review, but the manuscript has not finished going through the formal peer review process. Therefore, the content within a preprint may change once it is published. So here, my reactions will be to this non-peer reviewed form of the paper. I felt that the article was pretty well written, and the topic was simply too timely and too important to delay this discussion. So let's get started with the reaction. First of all, the paper gives some background in regard to NIH, for which quite a bit of investigation has been done into inequitable funding rates at the NIH. The paper states, funding agencies solicit proposals from principal investigators, or PIs, and process them through an evaluation system, making awards based on scientific and technical merit and broader impact. However, several studies over the past decade have shown inequalities in the allocation of research funding, most notably at the NIH, which is the National Institutes of Health. A 2011 study showed that Black PIs were funded at roughly half the rate as white PIs. Okay, and that ends the direct text from the article. I will link the paper that they cited for this study in the description box. So right off the bat, they start out with some pretty impactful references to past works, and this one stood out to me because the NIH funding mechanisms give the PI a chance to actually renew certain grants, such as the R01 funding mechanism. And from what I understand, the renewal process is not as rigorous as the initial funding application. And when you can renew your R01s for like years and years to come, the grants are roughly 5 years long. So those of us in academia will probably have a 20 to 30 year career. So an R01 can really last you throughout the bulk of your career, which leads to funding longevity and less stress overall in writing grants. So right off the bat, we're looking at cumulative impacts here. However, this paper is about NSF, so we're going to get into the authors' discussion of their analysis of funding data over the past 20 or so years. So in this next part of the paper, they're talking about the overall funding rates and the breakdown by racial group. So the article states, we find that proposals by white PIs were consistently funded at rates higher than the overall rate, with an average relative funding rate of positive 8.5% from 1999 to 2019. And they're referencing figure 1B, and you can see figure 1 on the screen. The relative funding rate for proposals by white PIs also steadily increased during this period from positive 2.8% in 1999 to positive 14.3% in 2019. The article continues. In contrast, proposals by most non-white PIs, specifically Asian, Black or African American, Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander PIs, were consistently funded below the overall rate, with average relative funding rates of negative 21.2%, negative 8.1%, and negative 11.3% respectively. I actually found these statistics to be really interesting. So most of us are aware that there is a relatively large representation of people that they group as Asian in STEM. So people that would be submitting for these grants relative to their population in the United States. And I will link the research by the Pew Institute on those breakdowns of occupation and race within STEM in the description box. So given the relatively large representation of Asian people in STEM and the fact that they have the worst relative funding rate, even across all minoritized groups, this is really, really surprising. Okay, it's really shocking. And you can see that in the graph on the screen, figure 1B. The Asian line in green is toward the bottom. So while Black and Hispanic, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander relative funding rates are low, it is Asian rates that are suffering the most in proportion to the white relative funding rate. My personal opinion in regard to all of this is that we shouldn't see these discrepancies, and in fact we should usually see funding rates and all that are proportional to the national population average. So we know that Black people, for example, are underrepresented in STEM relative to their U.S. population, and then they are underfunded relative to their proposal submission rate. So that's a compounded underrepresentation across federal funding from the NSF. And so I just feel like the national average population is a good target for these types of funding rates. And it should happen naturally, but unfortunately it doesn't. And the article goes on to explain these disparities. So further, the article states, the relative funding rates for research and non-research proposals by white PIs also gradually increased from positive 9% and positive 5.6% in 2013 to positive 14.8% and positive 13.2% in 2019. So an overall increase in both research and non-research proposals to the NSF. The article continues, research proposals submitted by white PIs had higher relative funding rates than non-research proposals. In contrast, research proposals by PIs from nearly every other racial and ethnic group had negative relative funding rates and were funded at rates generally lower than those for non-research proposals. So this, while it's believable, is pretty unfathomable, like how these biases just show up everywhere. So structural inequalities are just pervasive in the U.S. And so when it comes to research versus non-research proposals, as you can probably deduce, a research proposal is one that probably has a hypothesis, some objectives, and research plans. It's strictly based on scientific inquiry. A non-research proposal would be something that will fund the broadening of participation in engineering. It's meant to provide funding for instrumentation and things of that nature. So the minoritized groups are getting funded relatively lower for the research proposals compared to non-research proposals. And they'll talk about the cumulative impacts in and further along in the paper. The next point I want to highlight in terms of relative funding across racial groups is this part of the article that states, although Black or African American PIs submitted proportionately more non-research proposals, these proposals were consistently funded at lower rates compared to non-research proposals by white PIs. Okay, so the non-research proposals by white PIs are getting funded more, even though Black and African American researchers are proportionally submitting a lot of these non-research proposals. And so just a comment about this, in terms of my own experience, I actually submitted what I feel is more than average non-research, a more than average number of non-research proposals. Okay, and to this date, I haven't received funding for those. I'll talk about why I think that is toward the end of the video. And so some of those grants included, or some of those proposals included, those for undergraduate research participation in international programs, traineeship grants for post-baccalaureate scholars, and just in my experience, I don't hear anyone at the early career stage submitting these types of grants other than BIPOC and women, white women. I hardly ever hear any of like my male or non-minoritized counterparts talking about participation grants at the early career stage. So I have my thoughts on these funding rates, and I'll talk about that in just a second. The next part of the paper is analyzing the funding rates across the different NSF directorates. So directorates are organizational bodies within the NSF, and they are EHR, which is Education and Human Resources, SBE, which is Social, Behavioral, and Economic Sciences, Bio, which is Biological Sciences, Geo, which is Geosciences, SCIENCE, which is Computer and Information Science and Engineering, and obviously ENG, which is Engineering, and MPS, Mathematical and Physical Sciences. So if you submit a proposal to the NSF, you usually choose one directorate, unless it is a cross-directorate funding opportunity. So let's get into the directorate specifics for funding. The article states, for all non-white groups, relative funding rates for research proposals were below those for non-research, with rare exceptions. And that exception, for example, is the funding rate for Black PIs to the Geosciences Directorate. Okay. Moreover, in most directorates, the average relative research proposal funding rates for Black or African American PIs were lower than those for all other groups with available data. Consequently, the proportion of research awards to Black or African American PIs were below overall directorate proportions across all directorates. Okay, so what it's saying here is that the directorate-specific proposal funding rates are simply lower than everyone else's. And this is different from what we talked about in terms of the overall funding rates. Instead, we're comparing here within the racial group. Okay. This is consistent with what most of us know, which is in fact Black and African Americans tend to experience pretty high cumulative burdens of inequity in the United States, and of course that is showing up here in these directorate-specific relative research proposal funding rates. And so you can see it on the screen there, where on the x-axis it's the average relative funding rate by race and ethnicity, and on the y-axis it's the percentage of proposals in the directorate by PI and race, by PI, race, and ethnicity as well. So as you can see, the blue, the second panel with the blue markers shows that it's a relatively low percentage for each directorate, but the funding rate is in the negatives, as opposed to the red that's to the right, to the left of this African American box. The funding rates are in the positives. Okay. All right. The article talks about a paradoxical trend. It says relative funding rates for proposals by Black African American PIs are lower for directorates with proportionally more proposals from Black and African American PIs. Okay? With the exception of EHR. So what this is explaining is that percentage-wise, there are more Black PIs submitting to social behavior and economics and the engineering directorates compared to the other directorates. So there's more of us submitting to those, but those directorates actually have the lowest funding rates. So the concentration of grants submitted to those directorates is higher for Black PIs, but the overall funding rate is lower. Yeah, can't explain that one, but I would imagine that since our participation can be relatively low, or our representation in those fields can be relatively low, so that's due to this. Some would call it a leaky pipeline, some would call it a braided river, some would call it a hostile obstacle course. Because of all that, our experiences tend to be less than optimal, which propagates once again into the funding rates. The next part of the article talks about the distribution of external review scores. And just for reference, the article states, and most of us know, external reviewers must also give an overall rating on a scale from poor, which is numerically 1, and that means the proposal has serious deficiencies, to excellent, which is numerically 5, which means that the outstanding proposal in all respects. That's what that means. So 1 being the lowest, 5 being the highest. And as you can see on the screen, the figure 5 shows the distribution of those rating scales. And overall, you can see that the distribution curves across Asian and American Indian, Alaska Native are somewhat similar to the white curve, but noticeably so, the Black distribution is slightly to the left of the white PI rating curve, and the numerics are in the actual paper. You can go look at those. But this is a bit alarming to me for a number of reasons. Well, first of all, overall, I think that the distribution for the Black PIs is really due to a lack of mentorship and preparation. Just poor mentorship and preparation when it comes to submitting these grants. Somewhere along the way, we might not be getting exposed to the best practices for writing papers, or it takes us a little bit longer due to a number of cumulative impacts, and I'll discuss those at the end of the video. The other thing that's interesting about this is the curve or the distribution for Asian PIs. So statistically, they might be different, but visually these curves are not too much different. Yet the funding disparity is so high between the two groups. That is just mind-boggling to me, and I think that's probably one of the biggest aha moments out of this paper, which indicates that this is a serious issue. You know, the funding rate for Asian PIs that could also stand to get some attention when it comes to equity in funding. So that concludes my discussion of the results and the main conclusions drawn from the data analysis. Now I'm going to talk about some of the points later in the paper. So in the limitations section, the article states, we also observe an emerging trend in the non-reporting of demographic information from 1999 to 2019. The proportion of proposals submitted by PIs who provided information on their race decreased from 96% to 76%. So this and other discussions of limitations are in the paper. I think they did a good job, but I just wanted to point this one out because indeed fewer and fewer people are reporting their race, their gender, etc. And so we have to consider that there are some potential biases in the data. Sometimes I don't report my race or gender either. I know it's important for these statistics, but it just makes me feel even further minoritized to have to include my identity in these proposals when I know that my identity may be a deterring factor to getting funded. So it's a catch-22. Also in the limitations section, it states some discussion of other studies. So the authors control for factors that might affect grant success, such as educational background, research productivity, prior funding success, and institutional prestige. And even after controlling for these things, authors found, or other studies found, that applications by white PIs still had a 1.5-fold advantage over those by Black or African American PIs. The authors of this study highlight those of other studies that found evidence for additional racialized dynamics and intersectional biases. For instance, Black and African American and Asian PIs revised and submitted applications more times than white PIs before getting funded, meaning it's a resubmission and a revamp of the idea after addressing the panel comments. The article states that other studies found that Black and African American PIs were also less likely to resubmit a proposal after a failed attempt. Yeah, I can attest to this. Sometimes when your proposal gets scored and you see like an overall funding or overall score of like poor or fair, it's really hard to read those reviews, and you kind of just assume that it was a terrible idea and you probably just move on to the next idea without taking a look or revamping it. I have been encouraged to resubmit my proposals that didn't get funded by NSF, but by then I'm on to the next idea, and I really just don't want to revisit those painful reviews. Okay, and the paper goes on in the discussion to talk about how these statistics are aggregated. So let's read. The article states, the underrepresented minority aggregation diverts focus away from specific interventions that might address unique barriers to the success of Black African American PIs. Underrepresented minority aggregation also compounds the erasure of groups with relatively low numbers, such as Alaska Native and American Indian and Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander PIs, hindering our ability to understand and mitigate racial disparities that affect indigenous groups. I agree with this. The URM designation really doesn't get at the nuance at why certain groups face certain problems. So in our attempt to address equity issues, we love to do these blanket solutions because it's easy and I think it's lazy. So the way that we will approach, or that we need to approach, issues suffered by Black and African American PIs versus indigenous PIs are different. It's just simply different. We're facing different circumstances, so we need unique and different solutions. I will say that the under the hood community touches on issues that are specific to specific groups, but most or the majority of the content I produce on Under the Hood is extended to low income and BIPOC people in STEM. And finally, something that I want to talk about in the discussion is the following. It says, reliance on the underrepresented minority category may also have influenced NSF funding outcomes for Asian PIs who are not considered underrepresented minorities in STEM, yet experience the largest disparity in funding rates amongst all non-white racial groups. And the authors of this article further state, grouping Asians into a single racial category also overlooks heterogeneity in underrepresentation of certain groups. Completely agree. I completely agree with this. Just based on this report, the Asian group needs a really close look, okay, due to the alarming statistics that were brought out. I will refrain from commenting more on this, but I agree that the statistics do support the need to address this URM versus Asian designation when it comes to equity measures. Now we're going to shift into the article's discussion of cumulative impacts. Okay. The article states, a finding that is more alarming when considering their compounding impact. At the individual level, because grant reviewers must use past achievements as indicators of a proposing investigator's qualifications, increased research productivity from previous awards contributes positively to subsequent grant-seeking pursuits. This rich gets richer phenomenon, in which past success begets future success, has been widely documented in science since the 1960s. Okay, I found this to be really interesting. So they talk about this rich get richer. And even as a naive junior faculty member starting in 2018, I knew that early success early on in funding is the way to go. It's how you build momentum very quickly, because I knew that prior funding success was a marker and an indicator of your likelihood to get funded as an early career PI. So this is why I think the seed funding mechanism is so important for early career PIs, especially those from historically underfunded groups. First of all, seed funding is what I call low risk, high reward funding. So a seed fund or seed grant allows you to get and gather preliminary data, okay, in a low risk environment. So through the seed grant, you can demonstrate your ability to actually win competitive awards, but it's not as high stakes as the funding is with a federal agency that may blow back on you if the project doesn't go as planned. So even if the project doesn't go as planned, not much is lost in terms of funding, because these seed grants can range anywhere from $1,000 to maybe $20,000 and perhaps more from private institutions. So starting small early on was my funding strategy. I took advantage of internal grants on campus that were really small to launch new ideas, and also an external seed funding grant from a private institution that didn't have, it was the Sloan Foundation's Minority PhD Network. It was a $10,000 grant that wasn't constricted to a certain research topic. And so the seed funding grant from Sloan funded my pilot study for the wearable sensors. Okay. And doing that work, I actually went against the advice of someone who I consider an advisor. They told me to stick to what I know. And for me, that just wasn't like an optimal thing for me to do, to stick to what I know. So I branched out with the seed funding to do the wearable sensor work, and the rest is history. So for early career PIs that are listening, start small. You can be humble. Most of you that go into academia in a faculty position or leading a research lab, you'll get a startup fund, and you can consider that your seed funding as well. But you want to be careful with your startup fund, and I tend to lean conservative when it comes to spending my startup money. I try to get as much external funding as possible and use the startup award as like cushion and like my security blanket. So this rich get richer thing, you can enter into that. Although you don't want to perpetuate that, you can build some momentum in that way by getting some seed funding. The next point along these lines of cumulative impacts that I want to talk about from the article, it states, at the NIH, an increasing trend in the concentration of research funds to later career PIs in elite institutions has been linked to a decades-long continuous drop in the number of young PIs in biomedical research, and they cite 3 papers. At early, mid, and late career stages, non-white PIs must invest more time and energy than white PIs for funding access, and they cite about 7 papers here. Whew, this is a tough one for me. This whole thing about putting in a lot of effort at all stages of the career is scary to me. The learning curve is supposed to get shallower as you go on, and I just can't imagine putting in the type of effort to get good at my grant writing that I did in my early career and carrying that into late career. So honestly, my strategy to try to combat this was to focus the majority of my effort into grant writing in my first year. Even though I had a pretty decent startups account, I wanted to focus on grant writing and getting good at grant writing early on in tandem with preliminary data gathering. I knew that it was just important for me to build momentum quickly. I needed to surpass that learning curve quickly because, 2, 3, I mentioned this in a previous video, I think in the elitism video, about how your hyper awareness and hyper observation of your environment helps you to navigate. And what I observed is that people that got success early on in their careers with funding just tended to do better in terms of mentorship with their students, publishing papers, and just overall success. And so I said, okay, that's my strategy. Just try to get some funding. It was not easy, okay, because like I said, I didn't have the mentorship and the training to be good at grant writing early on. So one more piece of advice. My overall goal was to improve my funding rate as I go on in the form of decreasing the number of grants that I submit. And you can do that by submitting less proposals, by targeting larger grants, so grants that last more years, that offer more funding, and generally by writing better proposals. So your funding density increases, so the funding per grant or funding per submission, and your effort is optimized. So you want to, in terms of the fraction of proposals funded over submitted, you want the numerator to go up and you want the denominator to go down. Therefore, that ratio begins to increase over time. The next thing in regard to cumulative impacts that I want to point out from the article is the following. Because the median award size for non-research awards is less than that for research, the long-term financial impacts of funding disparities for Black African Americans, Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders, and American Indian and Alaska Natives, PIs, may be further compounded. So what they're saying is that since minoritized groups are winning more non-research awards than they are research awards, and because that those non-research awards are smaller, the cumulative financial impacts are higher. So if P then Q. So this is where I'm going to say that the cumulative impacts of our grant writing decisions are really, really serious, and they could propagate really far into our career. So any junior faculty or any new professor that talks to me, I give them the following advice, which seems to work, at least for one person that I coached through their first year. I found that a good rule of thumb is to submit at least 7 proposals in your first year. If you know you're not a strong grant writer and you need some help and some training in your first year, just submit 7 proposals. I got this number based on observing the success rate of about 1 in 7 proposals for most junior faculty. And I saw this at Riverside during the open merit reviews. So I'm not revealing any information. I just paid attention to the merit reviews, counted up the number of proposals submitted versus awarded, and it was about 1 in 7. This is generalized advice. Some people do better, some people do worse, but if you're targeting at least 7 diverse grant opportunities like seed funding, maybe not an early career award in your first year, but some good collaborative awards, your 3-year awards at NSF, you should hit at least 1. Now, the authors list a lot of the cumulative burdens that may contribute or compound or worsen this funding conundrum, and I just wanted to enumerate those, and they do cite other studies that have looked into these burdens. So the burdens that they list that compound with the funding inequity are the following: placement into lower prestige institutions as faculty, because we know that your institution is a huge dog whistle for funding success. Smaller institutional startup funds, this is true. Prestigious institutions will have a larger startup fund. Smaller collaboration and mentor networks, this is also true. Disproportionate service expectations, especially for minoritized individuals. This also leads to a time sink and a lack of success if not managed strategically. Lower salaries, added stressors in suboptimal work environments, leading to probably lots of stress and mental health issues. Gaps in citations, publications, promotions, and peer recognition that increase with career stage, they're saying, contributes to this, compounds this lack of success due to funding. And then they cite how all of these barriers tend to traumatize researchers that go through this, aggravate attrition, and impair health. Okay, so for anybody that's listening that has gone through all of these, you have my deepest sympathies and empathies. And to be honest, these issues can happen to anyone, and I've seen them happen to a lot of different identities, people with different identities, beyond being a minoritized individual in terms of your race and ethnicity. These can be some pretty detrimental impacts if they're happening all at once. And I am like super desperate to do something about this. I know that this is my minority tax, because I just can't stand the fact that people are going through this. And if there is anything that I've learned from my experiences, I'd like to share those so that we can close these gaps. And I think one of the ways we can do that is through inclusive and accessible mentorship online, where minoritized individuals, low-income individuals, marginalized individuals can come and listen to the oral history from another person that shares their identity and their circumstances. Because quite frankly, I'm tired of hearing about all of these problems, because we're going on 20 to 30 years for which these problems are persisting. And if you look at those time series in this paper, things are not getting better, they're getting worse. So what are we going to do about it? What can we do besides complain and not have any tangible solutions? And so I think the calls to action in the article at the end are pretty good, and I'm going to talk about what I think about those calls to actions. All right. So in this next part, we're moving into calls to action, and what NSF can potentially do to alleviate these issues. Article states the authors point to disaggregated data, or further disaggregating the data by race, ethnicity across institutions and other metrics, and actually developing equity metrics would be helpful for evaluating disparities and perhaps designing interventions for these disparities in order to move toward more equitable outcomes and funding. My thoughts. I am really not sure how we do this beyond instituting quotas. Okay? And we all know how people feel about quotas. Because changing people's minds at the proposal review stage is really hard. All right? It's really hard to convince a group of people to change their minds about what they find valuable in research. I see it every day. I'm living it every day. And this is backed up by this statement in the article. It says, a decade of efforts at NIH demonstrated that catch-all solutions such as increased bias awareness, training, and blinding the peer review process were inadequate as blanket solutions. So we can see that changing people's minds through intervention and bias training it doesn't seem to be working at the NIH. So it's very difficult for me to see how these racial biases, which are ingrained in U.S. politics, economics, social cultures, I just can't see any way around that other than trying to empower the individuals in the space, creating some institutional equity measures. But I just don't know how quotas are going to be received and if that is a good idea. The article did not talk about quotas, but that's the only thing I've seen in terms of like equity and funding as a solution. The next part in terms of what we can do to address these things, the article states, although diversity-conscious efforts in STEM are often perceived as in conflict with meritocracy or even as a threat to the core principles of science itself, in reality, these measures intend to disrupt the forces of systemic racism that jeopardize the integrity of scientific knowledge as a public good for all. I really liked this statement that is getting at the contention that is palpable in today's academic environment, that there's a conflict between diversity and meritocracy. But I'm going to go ahead and agree with the fact that actually being more diversity conscious is in fact a way to increase merit across these systems. Because if you're not considering all perspectives and you're only considering one or a few perspectives, you're losing out on innovation and the differences in the way people think that could actually improve collaborative experiences and improve solution building. Overall, I'm going through this at the moment. I've experienced a couple different poignant instances where meritocracy and diversity were at odds. For instance, I am constantly communicating at all levels, both public and private, about the challenges in environmental engineering where we're trying to address the grand issues that are faced by minoritized communities in this country. I'm actually seeking to conduct research and develop courses that specifically address these issues, things that get ignored in the engineering space. But there is a belief that applying traditional methods to investigate these challenges at the domestic scope and scale is not meritorious work. It's not work that is associated with merit, which is mind-boggling to me. I am going to assert that it takes actually quite a bit of creativity and courage to actually divert away from perceived research standards to address a looming problem from a different perspective. This is a form of synthesis. This is a form of creation, which is at the higher level of Bloom's taxonomy in learning, where you take one concept and apply it in another situation to create solutions from other learned experiences. Or maybe it's application. Maybe it's the third or fourth rung in Bloom's taxonomy. But I think that we should all seek to, those of us that are working on research that would be funded by NSF, that looks at things that are not in the traditional purview of STEM research. Speak about your research in a way that conveys its importance, okay? Use your traditional indoctrination to speak about those issues in intelligent ways. We don't have to, it is a grand challenge to reverse systemic racism in the U.S. That is a grand challenge and a difficult challenge. And so any work that seeks to do that, in my opinion, is meritorious. I'll end this discussion of this wonderful paper by reading what I think is a great excerpt from the end of the paper. It states, the scientific community must engage in a full-scale re-evaluation of scientific practice and culture, shifting the present scientific paradigm to be centered on equity will require individual, collective, and institutional commitments to elevating justice, respect, and community as core operating principles in science. Right on to whoever wrote this sentence or these sentences. Y'all, this is going to take effort at multiple scales. Okay? So individual scales, meaning those of us who are in these spaces, we're going to have to push back, open our mouths, we're going to have to work hard, and we're going to have to use our tools to make this a better place for the people coming after us. And that's what I'm doing. I'm doing this at the individual and collective scale in Under the Hood by providing extra mentorship, some dialogue about how to survive in these systems. But this has to happen at the collective and institutional scale as well. And unfortunately, without institutional commitments to such as equitable startup grants or startup funding, equitable salaries, there's very little along the lines of moving the bar that individual and collective movements can do. So individual efforts, collective meaning department, smaller scale efforts, have to be in line with the institutional mission. And I think that's really come together at Berkeley. I've heard some people express their skepticism about what's happening at Berkeley, but as a person who has a perspective at 2 UC campuses, I can say that at least what they're trying to do at Berkeley at the individual, collective, and institutional scale seems to be working, at least in the civil and environmental engineering department. So without the effort in tandem at all of these scales, it is likely that a minoritized individual will go through these systems and experience some form of trauma. So cheers to us developing interventions across scales and addressing the inequities that are talked about in this review of NSF funding. So I'd like to end this by thanking the authors, thanking Dr. Chen for her courage in putting this work together and leading it with her colleagues. And I look forward to the next review, and I'll see you guys in the next one.